Thank you very much for being here and coming to listen. And I wish to thank especially the Fondation Mérieux for inviting me to come speak to you today. I shall try my hardest to make it worth your while. My talk today will have 5 parts. In the first part, I pose the central question I will address, which is, if you were a policymaker and you had to evaluate a vaccine, which benefits of the vaccine matter? In the second part of my talk, I will discuss the 2 main answers given to that question. The first, which I will call the narrow view, says that only health benefits matter. This is usually allied with the view that health benefits are measured through QALYs, or quality-adjusted life years. The second candidate answer I will call the broad view. This view says that non-health benefits of vaccination matter as well. What are these non-health benefits? They can include various economic outcomes, such as economic growth, economic productivity, any macroeconomic consequences of outbreaks, the short-term impacts of declines in tourism, and so forth. They can include financial risk protection when people are insulated from the out-of-pocket costs of disease. They can include social concerns about equity or fairness. They can also include social concerns to give preferential treatment to those suffering from severe diseases or for those who are from especially vulnerable age groups, like children and the elderly. In the third part, I will argue that we have perhaps misunderstood the nature of the similarities and differences between the narrow and broad views. I will in particular urge a revision of our beliefs in 2 directions. First, I will argue that the critical difference between the 2 views is not the standard view that one is about health and the other one is about non-health, because I'm going to argue that they are both actually capable of incorporating non-health benefits. The real difference is that the narrow view is only able to capture what I'm going to call internalized health benefits, and therefore, internalized non-health benefits, and therefore what is actually distinctive about the broad view is its focus on externalities, a concept maybe familiar to economists, but that I will discuss a little bit more later. My second claim is that although QALY maximization, that is, the narrow view, is usually understood as being about the maximization of health, that this is in fact a little misleading, maybe more than a little misleading, maybe wrong. I will argue that QALY maximization is better understood as the maximization of intrinsic private value, whatever the object of that value happens to be. It could be about intrinsic health, but it could also be about well-being more generally. It could even be about the well-being of people other than the person whose health state is at risk. That's the third part of my talk. In the fourth part, I ask you to imagine you're a policymaker, going back to my main question. Which benefits count? You've got these 2 answers, the narrow view and the broad view. You might wonder, okay, well then, which is the better answer? The narrow view or the broad view? I'm going to address that issue obliquely. I'm not going to immediately ask which is the better answer. I'm going to instead ask, who gets to answer that question? Whose answer is decisive? Whose judgment about this question matters? I think once it's posed that way, the answer is obvious. So long as we believe government exists to serve the interests of the people, it's society's preferences regarding these narrow and broad benefits that matter, which means to address this main problem, we need to try to understand what social preferences are. Finally, I end my, sorry, I should have switched a few seconds ago. Finally, I will argue that we should replace the dominant paradigm of QALY-centric cost-effectiveness analysis that is based on the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio with a different paradigm that is centered on social welfare functions and the social rate of return. I will argue that this framework better represents social preferences in a way that is at least in principle agnostic between the narrow and broad views, but are perfectly capable of measuring the broad views in a way that the QALY framework is not. It's therefore more flexible. And it is also transformable into a decision criterion, the social rate of return, that policymakers can actually take, easily interpret, and use to inform real-world decisions. That is, in summary, what I'm going to discuss today. So let's begin. The first part, I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on my main question. My main question, again, is, assuming you're a policymaker and you have to evaluate vaccines, which benefits of a vaccine matter? I will interpret policymakers broadly. So a policymaker might be a health technology assessor or a NITAG confronted with a reimbursement decision. It could be a minister of health who's trying to decide on the relative share that vaccines should play in the fixed health budget vis-a-vis other health priorities such as reproductive health, chronic disease, smoking prevention, and so on. But the policymaker can be quite high up. The relevant policymaker could also be a minister of finance who has to address the question of the relative benefits of, say, vaccination or school construction, two quite different things. All of these are policymakers who will have to confront that question. What benefits do we get out of expenditures from vaccines? Now, in much of what I'm going to say today, I'm going to ignore costs. Not that they aren't important, it's just that I've got more than enough to talk about. So I will ignore the cost side of the equation, including any cost savings that result from vaccines. My main question, is a specific example of a much broader set of questions, right? You can imagine the health minister asking, so what are the relative benefits of vaccines vis-a-vis other things we can spend the health sector budget on, like, say, smoking cessation, or family planning, or chronic disease prevention, and so on. And as I already mentioned, you face this question at even higher levels of decision-making. How do I decide, if I'm the Minister of Finance, how to allocate the entire public sector budget? Under what circumstances is it defensible to take money away from the educational minister or from the transportation minister or to the education minister just so we can raise the vaccine budget? What are the relative benefits of that decision? There are two standard answers to this question. I've called them the narrow view and the broad view. And so I will now proceed to the second part of my talk and discuss these a little bit more. The narrow view is standardly understood as saying that when we measure the benefits of vaccines, only its health benefits matter. This narrow view is associated with two auxiliary elements. The first element is that health is measured through QALYs, or quality-adjusted life years. Therefore, the narrow view is also sometimes called the QALY maximization view, because that's effectively what the health policymaker is supposed to do, allocate resources and set priorities so as to maximize the QALY gain from a fixed pot of money. The second auxiliary element of this view is the view, as it is sometimes said, that a QALY is a QALY, is a QALY, is a QALY. We will return to this in about a minute or so. Now, since QALYs are going to be such a central part of my discussion, let's dig into it a little bit more. QALYs, I mean. I'm going to think or conceptualize QALYs as having two parts. The first part is the health state itself. The second part is what I'm going to call the private valuation of that health state. So the health state is that thing which is usually summarized in what's called a health state description, or HSD. I know that was a circular definition. But a health state is usually some description in biomedical, physical, empirical, or functional terms about the health-related circumstances of the person whose disease status is at issue. What's important about the health state is that it is given in pre-evaluative terms, in value-neutral terms, if you like. The second element is where the value part comes in. I've called this the private value or the health state valuation. The private value of a health state is usually a number between the 0 and 1 interval, where the better the health state is, the closer it is to 1. The worse the health state is, the closer it is to 0. So we usually assign the number 1, the value 1, to a state of perfect health, and the value 0 to death. Health state valuations are elicited through a varying number of devices, value elicitation exercises. Some of the most prominent ones are the standard gamble, the time trade-off method, visual analog scale, and so forth. Since the private values are also going to be a lot important to what I'm going to say, let's go into the standard gamble a bit. So, here's a standard gamble method for eliciting a health state valuation. Imagine that we have a person who is either quadriplegic or who faces the prospect of being quadriplegic, and this is the person whose private value we are trying to elicit. We ask that person to imagine that he or she is already a quadriplegic and that he or she will live in that health state for a certain duration. We ask that person, okay, you're in this quadriplegic state and you're going to live for a certain duration. You've got an option. Here is a health treatment that with probability P will kill you immediately, but with probability 1 minus P will eliminate your quadriplegia, after which you get to live for as long as the initial duration, how long you would have lived anyway. And the question we pose to this person is, what is the maximum risk of death you would be willing to tolerate to still accept this treatment? You can imagine the worse quadriplegia is for this person, the higher the risk of death he or she would be willing to tolerate. So imagine then that this person is willing to tolerate a 90% risk of death and still accept the treatment. Well, then it seems reasonable to suggest that a good index of the quality of life of quadriplegia is 1 minus P, in this case, 0.1 or 10%. So that's how the standard gamble works. You ask what the maximal risk of death this person is willing to encounter to be rid of the condition, and the health state valuation is 1 minus that probability, in our case, 0.10. Now, you'll notice when I described QALYs, I called the second element, the health state valuation, I called it the private value. That maybe you might find that idiosyncratic. What do I mean by private value? Well, in what follows, I'm going to need to distinguish among private value, public value, and social value. Private value, I take to be the value of the health state to the person whose health state it is. So in my example, it is the person who is either quadriplegic or who faces the risk of quadriplegia. Now, in some cases, the person is psychologically incapable of having such values, in which case private values will be those of the guardian of that person's interest. So it might be the parent of a child or the spouse of somebody who is cognitively disabled. Private values, I apologize for the layers of distinctions. Private values can be further distinguished according to intrinsic value and instrumental value. A health state has intrinsic value when it is valuable in and of itself, when you want the health state just because of the nature of the health state itself. So good examples of health states with intrinsic values are hedonic states. States such as either being in pain or being free of pain, being depressed, feeling anxious, and so on. These are states that we want, well, some of them we want to avoid just because pain itself we find in and of itself bad, and we find happiness in and of itself good. A health state, on the other hand, can have instrumental value when it's valuable because it leads to some other outcome, and it's that outcome that's got intrinsic value. For example, I value my vision, sorry, this is not me, this is a hypothetical me. I may value my vision because I really want to be a painter or a movie director or some sort of visual artist. So in this case, my vision has instrumental value in allowing me to fulfill one of my other intrinsic values, which is to be a visual artist. Note that it is perfectly possible for a health state, my vision, to have both intrinsic and instrumental value. Visual experience is, to me, good in and of itself, but it also happens to be good for other stuff too. So it has both intrinsic and instrumental value. So those are the two different forms of private value. What is public value? Public value is the value of a health state to any other person than the person whose health state that is. For example, if your catastrophic lifelong disability will be paid for by the public health system and could potentially raise my tax burden, then your health status will have public value, where I am the public. I will value your health, even if I'm not you, because it is instrumentally valuable to me, because it reduces the tax burden that I face. So that is the distinction between private value and public value. Private value is the value to the person whose health state it is. The public value is the value to anybody else. Social value I shall simply take to be the sum of the two. Yeah? So, now that I've created these multiple layers of dichotomies and trichotomies, we can go back to what I said was an auxiliary element of the narrow view, this principle that a QALY is a QALY is a QALY. How should we understand what that actually means? I think we should understand that view as the view that when we evaluate health benefits, only private benefits matter. We should take the view, a QALY is a QALY is a QALY, as saying that public values of health states are irrelevant or ought to be irrelevant to the policymaker evaluating the vaccines. For example, imagine that you value a year without sight at 0.7, so your private valuation of it is 0.7, and I value a year without hearing at 0.7. So my private value, I value a year without hearing at 0.7. So my private value of deafness is 0.7. Your private value of blindness equals my private value of deafness. These are identical QALY benefits. The QALY is a QALY is a QALY principle, therefore says the policymaker should treat them identically, which means what this principle really implies is that equality of private values is sufficient to fix the equality of the values of the health gains respectively. So if it should turn out that blindness that curing blindness has more public value, perhaps because the fiscal burdens or the macroeconomic consequences of blindness just happens to be worse. I don't know that to be true. I'm making that up. Then the narrow view would say, listen, that's not a QALY benefit. It's not denominated in QALYs. That's public value. That's irrelevant. So again, my main point here is that the narrow view, the QALY is a QALY is a QALY view, we should understand as the view that only private but not public benefits matter when we set priorities. That was the narrow view. Now, let's go to the broad view. So the broad view is typically understood as saying that non-health benefits matter as well. Now, there are auxiliary elements to this view. Of course, one is that, well, non-health benefits are not denominated in terms of QALYs, which means advocates of the broad view need to come up with a different theoretical metric that's able to capture these broad benefits. You have to go beyond, you have to propose something other than QALYs. It is also associated with the view that a QALY is not a QALY, is not a QALY. What would be examples of these non-health benefits? I've given a few here. Economic growth and productivity is a major example. And so short-term economic consequences of outbreaks, for example, would fall under that category. It also includes impacts of disease status on educational outcomes and therefore on lifetime incomes. Any impacts that a disease might have on poverty risk would fall under economic growth and productivity. Fiscal implications, particularly where healthcare expenditures are publicly financed. Financial risk protection that happens when healthier people are not exposed to the potentially catastrophic out-of-pocket expenditures associated with disease. Equity and fairness also falls under these non-health benefits. I argue that this broad view that a QALY is not a QALY, is not a QALY, we should understand as saying, you know what? The public values matter as well. When we assess the goodness and badness of health states from the point of view of priority setting, we have to include not just the value of the health state to the person who experiences it, but to the rest of society as well. So here I go back to my example. You value a year of your life blind at 0.7. I value a year of my life deaf at 0.7. But it just so happens that the fiscal and productivity consequences of visual disability are larger than those of hearing disability. Then the broad view says, listen, there is larger public and therefore social value to preventing the blindness. And therefore the priority tilts in favor of preventing the blindness. That is what's distinctive about this view. And so that ends the second part of my talk. So far, I hope you've realized that I've not argued for either of these views. I've only articulated them and presented what I hope you don't find too idiosyncratic an interpretation of these views. And here in my third part, I'm not going to argue for one over the other either. Rather, what I'm going to argue is that perhaps the standard way we understand the narrow and the broad views are not quite right. They're at least misleading. They may be downright wrong. The standard understanding, to repeat, is that the narrow view says only health benefits matter, where health is measured in QALYs. The broad view says non-health benefits matter as well. I'm going to make two claims here that challenge that standard understanding. I'm going to say that, you know what, QALYs, they can internalize some non-health benefits. What we should think is distinctive what we think should be distinctive about the broad view is its emphasis on externalized non-health benefits. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Second, I'm going to argue that we ought to understand maximizing QALYs not so much as maximizing health, but as maximizing intrinsic private value I've defined the terms intrinsic and private, and so you have a sense of what that claim means. Regardless of what the object of those intrinsic private values happen to be. They may be about health, but not necessarily. So let me go to the first claim. The first claim, again, is that QALYs, they do internalize some broad benefits. I make this claim by going back to my standard gamble example. Remember in that standard gamble, we asked a person who was either quadriplegic or faced with the prospect of quadriplegia, how much, what risk of death are you willing to face to accept this treatment? And we said, he or she had said 0.9. Note that we never restricted the kinds of reasons that that person may have for choosing 0.9. And that is, in fact, intrinsic to the standard gamble approach, and in fact to all other health state valuation elicitation methods. People can invoke any intrinsic reason they have for wanting to confront such a high risk of death. Imagine that you've just done your standard gamble, the person is sitting in front of you, and you actually try to interview this person. Please, sir or ma'am, tell me, why did you choose to confront such a high risk of death? Why 0.9? That person might well say, you know what, I'm really worried about my family. Quadriplegia is financially catastrophic. And if I were to become quadriplegic, I am risking the financial security of my loved ones. Perfectly reasonable answer to give. Note, though, that it is a non-health benefit. The financial risk protection of people other than myself falls into the enumeration I gave 1 or 2 slides ago. What this implies is that health state valuations, QALYs, and therefore the narrow view, is in fact able to incorporate certain kinds of non-health benefits. That person might also have said, listen, if I'm quadriplegic, I will not be able to achieve a certain material lifestyle that I want. And so my lifetime income would suffer. That is also among the non-health benefits that I mentioned. What we see, therefore, is that the narrow view is in fact able to incorporate some non-health benefits, which means the narrow view is not as restrictive as we might think it is. What is the case, though, is that the narrow view is able to incorporate these non-health benefits only to the extent that the person whose health state is involved happens to care about them. In my taxonomy, non-health benefits are allowed to count within the QALY framework to the extent that they are privately valued, to the extent that the person whose health state it is internalizes that non-health value. So I believe that my claim, at least the first part, is justified, that QALYs can internalize non-health benefits so long as they are privately valued. Some corollaries follow from this. First, the only non-health benefits that the QALY framework can't get are those that the person whose health state it is doesn't care about. It's only external non-health benefits that the broad view, as it were, brings to the table. Such externalities are therefore the distinctive province of the broad view. So a second corollary then is that I think it's not so accurate to describe the difference between the narrow view as the narrow and broad view as one saying health matters, the other one saying, as one saying only health matters, and the other one saying non-health benefits matter as well. It is more accurate to say that they both allow non-health benefits to matter. The difference is that the narrow view only encompasses internalized non-health benefits. The broad view also encompasses external ones. A third corollary, and this is actually quite relevant for research, is that there are double counting problems that start to lurk in the background. We have to make sure when we are measuring the value of vaccines and presenting them to the NITAG or to the health technology assessor that we do not double count benefits. Imagine that you're a health economist and you're doing an economic evaluation to submit to a NITAG some vaccine, and the first thing you do is you measure the QALY benefits. You measure the QALY benefits, you've got some number that represents the QALY benefits, and then you think, aha, wait a minute, that's not the only thing we get from the vaccine, because this person who's healthier, this person's lifetime income will be higher. This person's family will benefit from the insurance value of not having to face the out-of-pocket costs of the disease. Let me measure those as well. So I'm going to measure a second aspect of benefits, the improvement in lifetime income. A third set of benefits, the insurance value. I go to the NITAG and I go, look, there are 3 benefits, not 1. Add them up and they're larger than just the first. If what I'm saying is right, that's double counting. It is entirely possible that the very first element in the enumeration already includes the other 2. Among the reasons the QALY loss from your disease is so high is precisely because the person whose health state it is internalized the impact on lifetime income, internalized the impact on the financial security of the household. So there is, in some sense, my argument makes life a little bit harder, because one does have to take more seriously this notion of fully accounting for the complex structure of health and well-being over a person's life and over a household's life. And that is a non-trivial problem. It would be wonderful if there were no double counting, because you just add them up. But with this prospect, things get much more hairy. That is my first claim. My second claim is that maximizing QALYs is best understood not as maximizing health or even well-being, but rather as maximizing intrinsic public value, whatever the object of that value. So what this claim is rebelling against, if you like, is the standard view that maximizing QALYs is about maximizing health. To make my claim, I'm going to lean a lot on this dichotomy that I earlier made between intrinsic and instrumental value. Remember, something has intrinsic value when it's valuable in and of itself. Something has instrumental value when it's only valuable in lieu of contributing to something else that has intrinsic value. It should be fairly clear that when it comes right down to it, it's really the only thing that's real value here is intrinsic value. Instrumental value is wholly derivative. And so if we look at what values really matter, we're really thinking about we're really asking ourselves, what are the intrinsic values with respect to a vaccination? It might help the mathematically inclined among you to think about it this way. In mathematical terms, instrumental value is a function of intrinsic value. So if you ever had a mathematical expression where you have an instrumental value term there, you can always substitute it out with the underlying intrinsic value. For example, if you're a policymaker, you're maximizing QALYs, you're trying to write down your objective function, you've got a bunch of health states, and you multiply the health states by the values of the health states. If you just happen to put the instrumental value of the health state in the maximand, somewhere along the way, as you solve your maximization problem, you will be substituting it out, and you will be putting in the intrinsic values. And so at the end of the day, your objective function is really stated in terms of intrinsic values, not instrumental values. So the intrinsic values are where it's at. But so let's ask the question now, okay, what intrinsic values are served by QALY maximization? And here I lead you back to the example of quadriplegia. Again, imagine that you interview the person and ask, why did you really say 0.9? My guess is this person will tell us intrinsic values in 3 different categories. One are intrinsic values related to that person's own health. avoiding the pain and discomfort of quadriplegia, something that that person values in and of itself. But that person will likely also mention some intrinsic non-health values that have to do with his or her own well-being. Perhaps the ability to have a desired career. Maybe he or she wants to be a globe-trotting business person or an entrepreneur, and quadriplegia will harm that goal. Or it could be that this person genuinely, intrinsically cares about the financial security of the other persons that he or she lives with. And so it's the financial security of the household that is to this person intrinsically valuable. You will see, therefore, that the intrinsic values served by quality maximization are not all health. Some of them involve the non-health aspects of that person's well-being, but some of them actually include the non-health well-being of other people, which means it would be wrong to characterize quality maximization as the maximization of the intrinsic value of health. It's not true. It's more correct to say that quality maximization is the maximization of intrinsic value, whatever the object of that intrinsic value might happen to be. And we've seen here 3 different objects it might have: own health, own well-being, but others' health and others' well-being as well. Now you might ask, okay, as far as enumeration goes, yeah, there are 3 different categories of intrinsic goods. But isn't it likely to be true that the intrinsic health values are going to be the largest part? Maybe it's like 95% of these 3 things added up? The answer to that is, as an empirical matter, I don't know. Maybe it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Maybe it is, in fact, the intrinsic health value that predominates. Maybe it's at 90%. Maybe other things are at 5% each. But the point is, the exact divvying up is completely irrelevant, because the quality framework is, and I believe rightly so, agnostic with respect to the relative share of intrinsic health, intrinsic well-being, and intrinsic health and well-being of others. What the quality maximization framework does, and I think rightfully so, is it defers to the private values of the person involved to determine how to divvy up the relative weights of health, well-being, and others' health and well-being. So health is actually preeminent in the quality maximization framework only in the instrumental sense. Health is the primary control knob in the health sector, and therefore it is the quantity with the maximal instrumental value. That's nothing to sneeze at. Still, it remains that as a normative matter, health is not intrinsically preeminent to non-health goods. The framework defers to the structure of our private value judgments to determine the relative importance of intrinsic health and intrinsic non-health goods. Why do I make this point? I make this point because it highlights another similarity between the broad and narrow views. Because the broad view is exactly the same way. Neither view takes health to be intrinsically preeminent to other intrinsic goods. It defers to the structure of private judgments to determine whether in fact health is important, but it allows other things to be important as well. So the difference between the 2 views is less than you might think. So, where are we? I'm moving now to the 4th part of my talk. I've posed the main questions. Which benefits matter to policy? I've articulated the 2 main answers, the narrow view and the broad view. I've argued that we should revise our understanding of the narrow view and broad view as being more similar than they are, and to reconceptualize the sense in which they're different. But again, so far, I've not argued against one, for one or the other. I will segue into that topic now, but I will do so obliquely. I will not immediately ask, which answer to the question is superior? Instead, I will ask, whose answer to that main question actually matters? Because this is where I think we really find the answer. And I believe, so long as we all share the view that government exists to serve the interests of the people, the answer is clear. It's society's answer to that main question with which I began that's ultimately decisive between the narrow and the broad view. And so I conceptualize and I urge us to adopt the view that the relationship between society and the government is what economists call a principal-agent relationship. That relationship is a relationship between two entities, the principal, whose interests are paramount, and the agent, who has some responsibility to act in such a way as to fulfill that principal's interests. And so since society's preferences are decisive, it's this concept, these social preferences, that policymakers, academics, policy advocates really need to try to discover. In particular, there is a particular question with respect to which we should try to assess what social preferences are, because I think this question is decisive between the narrow and the broad view. And that question is the following. Does the value to society, that is, to you, of some public sector output depend on which ministry produced it? Example, say that you want to live a long life, so you value mortality risk reductions. You really want the public sector to produce mortality risk reductions. Is it the case that you would value a mortality risk reduction only when it comes from some health ministry policy, but not when it's produced, say, by some energy ministry policy? Would you? Or would you value mortality risk reductions produced by the health minister and energy minister equally? Another example, say that you actually value reducing your risks of falling into poverty. Do you really care whether your poverty risks are minimized through some social transfer policy or through some health ministry policy? If your answer to this question is no, then the broad view wins. Why? Because if your answer to those questions is no, then the health minister, the NITAG, the health technology assessor, as a faithful agent, has a duty to give to the financial risk protection and health economic benefits of vaccination the exact same value that, say, the finance minister does, or the social transfer minister does if there was a Ministry of Social Transfers. So my guess is that what matters to society is the outcome of a policy as opposed to the policy instrument that brought it about. And so, well, I've already said that next sentence. Let me just read this paragraph at the bottom. Just as we want the energy minister to do full justice to the health consequences of energy policy, so we want the energy minister to do full justice to the health consequences of energy policy, so we want the health minister to do full justice to the broad socioeconomic consequences of health policy. We should understand line ministries, that is, ministries of health, education, energy, and finance, as each specializing in a particular set of institutions, technologies, and expertise, but together optimizing with respect to a single menu of value-weighted social goals, with a single government-wide value of a statistical life, for example, or the same value to lifting a household out of poverty. To do otherwise is to imply that the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. This is a massive coordination failure that leaves society worse off. And so socioeconomic benefits should count equally across all ministries, and therefore should be given full credit by ministries of health and its designated officials. My last topic is that, my last argument is that we should replace QALYs, this framework of QALYs and incremental cost effectiveness ratios, with another framework that's centered on social welfare functions and social rates of return. So I ended my fourth part by arguing that social preferences matter and that we really need to learn what social preferences are. But the thing is, social preferences are not immediately useful for the policymaker. They need to be transformed into some kind of decision criterion that a policymaker can calibrate with data and take to actual decision-making problems. In fact, one of the strengths of the narrow view is that it's got that framework already in place. It's got quality-adjusted life years. It's got a very transparent, easily interpretable decision criterion called the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio that tells the policymaker exactly how to compare different health policies. It's been stated, in fact, in the literature, that the reason the narrow view, the QALY view, is so deeply entrenched is because everybody knows the QALY framework's got problems, but they don't know what to replace it with. I wish to argue that we do have something we can replace it with, and that is this framework of social welfare functions. Now, economists and decision scientists know that when individual preferences satisfy certain axioms, they can be represented through individual utility functions. The same thing is true of social preferences. When they satisfy certain axioms, you can represent them through mathematical objects called social welfare functions. Here's an example. This expression is a social welfare function. W stands for social welfare. It's measured over this artificial society where there are just two people. I've labeled them persons 1 and 2. The overall well-being of these two people are represented by these utility functions, U sub 1 and U sub 2. Each utility function is a function of two arguments, H, which is the health status of the person involved, and C, which is all other determinants of well-being. If you like, you can represent that as the consumption of goods and services. You will see that there, each term has an exponent, P, which is just a scalar, which is in the unit interval. Standard results from social choice theory show that when social preferences satisfy certain axioms, I've enumerated them there. You can read them. I'm not going to discuss them. They're rather intricate. When those axioms are satisfied, social welfare functions have that form. This may look like a fairly unremarkable equation, but there's quite a lot of depth in it. Because this formulation can capture the entirety of QALY analysis as a special case, but it can capture other things besides that are out of reach of QALY analysis. For example, it measures very well the interaction between the health and non-health aspects of the life through the functional form that relates C and H. It's able to represent risk aversion and, in fact, diminishing marginal utility of income through the curvature of the function U. And it's actually also able to represent social preferences for equity and distribution through the value of that parameter exponent P. When P equals 1, you notice that this collapses to the utilitarian social welfare function, which is indifferent to distributional considerations. But the closer P is to 0, the stronger the preference is for equality. So how do we use this? Well, let's see how you would actually use this to address a particular program. Imagine a fictional program where we tax person 1. We use the tax revenue to purchase a vaccine, and then we vaccinate person 2. In this framework, taxing person 1 will cause person 1's goods and services consumption to fall. So C1 will fall. If C1 falls, that entire first term on the right-hand side falls. That U sub 1 term, that's going to fall because C1 falls. That gives us the cost of this simple policy, the fall in the utility of person 1. You take the revenues, you vaccinate person 2. That means health status of person 2 will rise. H sub 2 will go up, which means the overall well-being of person 2 will rise. That's the benefit of this program. So in my simple policy, the first term falls, The second term rises. Whether social welfare increases or not, meaning whether W is positive or negative, depends on the relative size of the costs and benefits. But we can express that the following way. If you like, take total differentials of that expression, then on the left-hand side, you would have the change in social welfare. On the right-hand side, the first term is the impact on person one's utility. That's negative. I've called that the costs. The benefit is the improvement in the health of the second individual. That's positive. That's B. We can show that dW is greater than 0, meaning there is a net benefit, if and only if the following sequence of equations hold. Minus C plus B is positive, B is greater than C, B over C is greater than 1, B over C minus 1 is greater than 0, and then finally at the bottom we have the social rate of return. B minus C over C is greater than 0. So you can see how this framework of representing social preferences through a social welfare function can be transformed into a decision criterion, the social rate of return, that you can parameterize with data and take to a policymaker and use to evaluate and advocate for or against a particular policy. The larger the social rate of return, the better the policy is. Note one spectacular thing about the social rate of return. You can apply this to the assessment of a vaccine. So you can compute the social rate of return to vaccination. You can also apply it to the construction of roads and schools. So you can measure the social rate of return to building an extra kilometer of highway, which means it allows you to assess the relative costs and benefits, not just of competing health interventions, but just competing public sector interventions more generally. So not only is this helpful to the health minister or the NITAG, it's helpful to the finance minister who has to compare the relative benefits of vaccination and road construction. So this is a huge benefit of this approach. So we actually do have a readily available alternative to QALY analysis. This social welfare function, social rate of return view, is very well suited to capturing social preferences very, very flexibly. It's able to encompass both health and non-health benefits, as well as internalized and externalized ones. It has the significant benefit of being comparable across health and non-health policy interventions. It's easily interpretable, and it captures so many relevant principles: risk aversion, equity, fairness, diminishing marginal utility, the interaction of the health and the non-health aspects of a life. So I advocate greater awareness of this framework, greater understanding and greater use of it. I encourage researchers and policymakers to become more familiar with it, to assess health technologies, and to argue for or against health technologies using this framework. Thank you for your time.